Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mitch Landrew. I want to welcome you to the second panel of Pluribus Unum's Truth, Action, and Reconciliation Conversation Series. We are so grateful that you've chosen to spend the next hour with us. When we formulated the idea for these panels, we wanted to add voices to Americans calling to account our country's values and the systems that reflect them. And to respond to that call, we knew that we had to start with telling the true story, the whole story, of our country's role in creating inequitable systems. In addition to the truth telling, we will also be presenting discussions on the ways to combat inequity and what we all gain when we change these systems to serve everyone equally. Last week, we had an unbelievable conversation with Dr. Drew Faust from Harvard and Eddie Glaude from Princeton on our overall history that led to these systems, who were also joined by Dr. Tamika Simmons. This week, we're going to discuss the evolution of America's criminal justice system, how it was designed, and the price that we have paid for that design. We have a lot to discuss, and I am so honored to be joined today by a distinguished panel. The first is Dr. Khalil Muhammad, who is a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. Dr. Muhammad's scholarship examines the broad intersections of race, democracy, inequality, and criminal justice in modern history. He is the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, which won the 2011 John Hope Franklin Best Book Award in American Studies. The second panelist is Charles H. Ramsey, who served as police commissioner of the Philadelphia Police Department from 2008 to 2016. Prior to his appointment in Philadelphia, he served as the chief of police in Washington, D.C. He is a native of Chicago, as is Dr. Muhammad, and he served there for many, many years as a young police officer before becoming a chief. He was also selected by President Obama to be the co-chair of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Our third panelist is Police Commissioner Michael Harrison. He was sworn in as Baltimore's Police Department's 41st commissioner on March 12th in 2019. Before coming to Baltimore, Commissioner Harris served as the police chief in the New Orleans Police Department, where he was a police officer for 28 years. Among his many assignments when he was there was supervisor of the Public Integrity Bureau, commander of the Specialized Investigations Division. In 2014, he was appointed superintendent and helped lead that department through this country's most robust consent decree as an effort to reimagine and reform the New Orleans Police Department. So all panelists, thank you so much for being with us for this, what I hope will be a very provocative discussion. And with your permission, Dr. Muhammad, I'd like to go to you first and ask you a little bit about the history of policing in America. And as we reflect on our nation's history, the intersection of crime and race has always been at the forefront of criminalization. Public opinion about race and crime is shaped by narratives, public notions of criminality that are linked to the legacy of racism. And I want you to take us through some pivotal historic events that have created not only the historical link between crime and race, but also the narrative that put the country in a position of trying to understand criminalization through the lens of race.
Well, thanks, Mitch, so much for having me. And it's a pleasure to have this chance to be in a conversation with Commissioner Ramsey and Chief Harrison. Commissioner Ramsey and I have spent some time together learning about our own professional journeys and sharing some insights in another context. So this is a joy to be together again. Listen, the history is long and complicated. It's 401 years since 1619, when the first Africans became part of the American experiment. And it's not an exaggeration to say that from the very beginning, not only creating a system of chattel slavery, that is to define people of African descent as property, as an efficient way of sorting them as the essential workers of colonial America, also came with it what amounted to a massive law enforcement bureaucracy. It was an extension of the militia of colonial governments. We called them slave patrols. And essentially their job was to make sure that Black people wouldn't steal themselves, wouldn't be guilty of felony crimes of virtue of trying to escape their enslavement. And that it existed for 240 years. I mean, again, as much as Americans understand the moral abomination that slavery was, they don't necessarily really take full account of how deeply ingrained the cultural significance of empowering the entire white population, landowners, plantation owners, landless whites, all with the duty to police the comings and goings of the Black population during slavery times, and to dispense corporal punishment with any allegation of unauthorized movement. So that covers the majority of American history. At the end of slavery, we saw overnight not just the abolition with the exception for crime. The 13th Amendment has this incredible loophole that is still part of our Constitution. We live in times where we debate about originalist interpretation of the Constitution. Well, the originalist interpretation of the 1865 13th Amendment is that slavery can still exist in the United States and in its territories as quote unquote punishment for a crime. What was the original intent behind this was to essentially maintain the fact that people who had been deemed criminal in the entire experiment of America were put to work, were put to hard labor. And the exigencies of the South after the Civil War was to ensure maximum control over the now free Black people, these new citizens of America. So for roughly the next 100 years, from the Black codes to felon disenfranchisement laws to the basic infrastructure of white supremacy that's set in the South and made Black people permanent second-class citizens, law enforcement was absolutely complicit, aiding and abetting that process. Black people simply could not serve on juries. They could not testify in their own defense. They didn't have access to indigent defense, for example, until the 1960s. This was the state of play after slavery for the next century. But this isn't just a Southern story. In northern cities, as Black people escaped lynch mobs that, again, often wrestled Black defendants and suspects from the clutches of law enforcement. Sometimes they were handed over and sometimes law enforcement participated. But by the time we get to the 1910s and 20s, as African Americans are joining this rush for industrial labor, they're working in factories. They're in my hometown. This is a time when my grandparents came of age in Chicago. Black people are trying to fulfill the hopes and dreams and possibilities of the promised land. And yet they simply are not being treated with the same due process, the same protection and service that police officers are providing. Police officers in this sense show us in the North, going back 100 years, that their primary obligation was to serve the interests of a white elite, first and foremost, of which European immigrants often suffered, low-income whites as well. But then secondarily, the entire white community, to keep Black people out of their neighborhoods, to ensure that if there was a racial conflict, if there was beef between a white person and a Black person, the white person would be given the benefit of the doubt and sometimes actually be aided in their racist terror. There's no escape to a golden age of policing that is colorblind, race neutral when we look back on our history. And indeed, because policing is the front line of the criminal justice system, it also means that they are the mechanism to produce the crime statistics that became weaponized going back to the end of slavery for pointing to the overrepresentation of Black people in the system, to justify through those arrest statistics and incarceration rates going back to the 19th century, not just since 1994 with the crime bill or in more recent decades. I'm saying 100 years, crime statistics have been weaponized to say Black people are a dangerous criminal population. They are collectively guilty. And because they are collectively guilty, they're not subjected to the same due process, equal protection guarantees as the rest of us. And so the narrative of crime statistics, of Black on Black crime, of pointing to the collective guilt of Black people has in many ways been at the root of systemic racism in every sphere of American life. And the last chapter of this I'll mention is, we imagine that with the civil rights movement from 1954 to 1965, that we could have entered a period where much of this racist past would be put behind. But indeed, we know, starting with a series of uprisings in Philadelphia in 1964, Watts in 1965, more than 150 conflagrations in 1967, producing the Kerner Commission report. The most unifying theme and evidence that came out of that was the Black community's deep resentment of feeling like they were living in occupied territory, as James Baldwin once says. And you know that there's an old Richard Pryor joke, right? Like, who you gonna believe, me or your lying eyes. And so Black people kept saying, we have a structurally racist police problem in America, and we're not going to take it anymore. And so that produced the Kerner Commission. What came of the Kerner Commission and its findings and affirming what happened was, as you wrote, Mitch, so beautifully in the New York Times, nothing. Nothing came of it. But instead, we got what it amounted to: a war on crime, a war on drugs, and then the apparatus, the policy changes that made possible mass incarceration. So I'll put a bookmark in it because we can talk about what that looked like over the last 20 years, but it's not a good history when it comes to helping us think through what we ought to be doing now.
Yeah, well, that was a great recitation. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. But I'll ask you one more question, and then Chief Ramsey, I'm going to come to you. So as a consequence of that, the movements of resistance that we're seeing throughout the country against police brutality right now, overwhelming, clearly, and have been going on for quite a long time. However, we know these acts of resistance are not a new phenomenon in our history. You talked a little bit about the 60s. Can you walk us through some of those historic acts of resistance? And do you think that the movement that we're seeing now is different and going to get us to a better or a truer place of real change?
Yeah. So this is kind of the parallel flip side, but I can say it more briefly. Listen, when Black people stole themselves from slavery, that was a form of resistance to the systemic racism of slavery. When Black people joined the Union Army, they were fighting against a system that was a moral abomination. When Black men armed themselves, claiming their Second Amendment rights in the 1870s during Reconstruction, when the federal government occupied the South, when they established Black militias to protect the sanctity of home and church and community for Black folks, they were resisting the tyranny of white supremacy that had carried over from slavery into freedom. When Black people moved north and decided that they would walk pridefully down the middle of the street, own a home in a South Side Chicago neighborhood or a West Philadelphia or North Philadelphia home, those were all acts of resistance. When they told the commissioners in Chicago in the riot report of 1922 that became the first Blue Ribbon Commission panel on police brutality, what had been happening to them, and that could be affirmed by white members of the criminal justice community, those were acts of resistance. And of course, when Black people took to the streets in Harlem in 1935, in Harlem in 1943, as I mentioned in California and so many other places in the 1960s, those were acts of resistance. But there's a key thread here that I think is important. For as much as the NAACP came into existence in 1910, not to desegregate schools, not to equalize educational opportunities, they came into existence in 1910 to fight the spread of lynching in America. It had already been a problem for 3 decades in the South. It was coming north, and they said, this can't happen. They failed repeatedly, decade after decade, to fight the lynching scourge because of the deeply entrenched nature of lynching and white supremacy and indeed law enforcement. So the civil rights movement itself, in some ways, never picked up that failure. They never advanced the argument about the fairness of the criminal justice system, the racism in the criminal justice system. And in many ways, this problem is the unfinished work of the civil rights movement going back to the 1960s. And so Black Lives Matter has it right. They've centered state violence as the key and the linchpin for all these other broken systems in our society. And therefore, it's up to us. It's up to us to figure out how we're going to respond to that challenge.
Thank you, Khalil. I appreciate it. You know, that recitation of history and the moments of resistance, brings up a question, really, Chief Ramsey and Chief Harrison, that I want to ask both of you. Given that history, both of you guys, as young African-American men, Chief, you got a couple of years on Chief Harrison, but in the 60s, and then I think in the 80s, can you remember what you guys were thinking about when you were trying to figure out what you wanted to do with your life and you decided to join a police department, and the kind of pressures that you felt, or the reasons why you thought that's where you could make a difference in the world? Chief Ramsey, if you would.
Well, I grew up during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. My teen years were in the 1960s. I accidentally became a police officer. My dream was to become a doctor. I wanted to study medicine. And I learned about a police cadet program that the Chicago Police Department had through a police officer that I came to know. And what was attractive was the fact that they paid your tuition, and I was not a scholarship kid, and there was no obligation to become a police officer. So I decided to join. And right away, for me, it was the right fit. But in the 1960s, for a young African-American to become a police officer, it wasn't the most popular thing I could have chosen to do. And so there were friends of mine that I actually lost as a result of choosing to become a police officer. But when I joined the Chicago Police Department at a time when there was still a great deal of segregation within the department. In fact, I remember the big social experiment in the Chicago Police Department at the time was assigning a black and a white officer in a car together as a two-person car. They called them salt and pepper cars. I mean, it was just, can a black and a white work together? I mean, that was a big deal. And so, you know, things were quite different in the 1960s, both in the police department as well as in the communities. And as the doctor well knows, being from Chicago, Chicago was a very segregated city, still is to a large extent. So it carried over from, you know, the neighborhoods into the police department, obviously.
Wow. Chief Harrison?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I'm honored to be among this group of panelists, and certainly honored to be in your presence again. I enjoyed working with you for the 4.5 years in New Orleans. I came on a few minutes after Commissioner Ramsey in 1991. In 1991, and so if you remember then, you know, the crack cocaine epidemic was on the rise. I was in and out of school, and I was in the National Guard. So I was parking cars at the Hyatt Regency as a valet during the week. And then on the weekends for my National Guard duty, I was in security police. And so being in the National Guard, there were quite a few police officers who were members of the Louisiana Air National Guard. And as a National Guard police officer, I just migrated over to joining the New Orleans Police Department, because there were quite a few members who were members of the National Guard. And I fell in love with it. I personally needed a military structure in my life. That's what I needed, and I fell in love with the military lifestyle and the structure. And so the police academy and the police department appeared to be a natural fit. And once I was in, I fell in love with it. And it was a time in New Orleans where in 1991, I graduated early 92, murders were an all-time high, and there was a lot of violence in the city. And it just seemed like my calling, my duty, the thing I needed to do was to help put an end to that violence. And so it was all about the work, the drug wars you heard Dr. Muhammad talk about, and I was a product of that. And then migrated into the narcotics unit and went to work undercover for a number of years. And so it was my job to go around town buying crack cocaine and other drugs from would-be drug dealers to help in the fight against drugs. Now knowing now that I'm a police chief, that in those days we probably did as much, if not more, harm than good. And so that was kind of how I got my start. I just needed this military, paramilitary lifestyle with structure. The National Guard and the police department were both a good fit for me.
Right. But Chief, let me push you on that a little bit. You know, when you were on the street doing that work, now that you look back on it, you said you think you guys did more harm than good. Can you take us through what that feels like when you're the police officer on the ground and you're engaged in activity, and why? Was it systemic, or what was it that causes you now to look back on that and say that you guys could have done a better job? It was
systemic. And at first, the drug dealers were wide open because they were just doing it and getting away with it. But the more intense that drug fight got in New Orleans, what we found was that the dealers got smart and they evolved, just like the police officers involved. And what happened was the dealers began to back up, and they would allow the addicts to walk up to the car and to the undercovers to actually make the transaction. So in many of those deals, it was actually an addict or somebody who was addicted who was actually coming to me to sell to me. That was the person getting arrested more often than not. There were times we could identify who the real dealer or trafficker was, but sometimes we weren't able to do that. And a person who was probably addicted to drugs was the seller and got arrested and went to court. Now, many times they were actually convicted because you had a police officer on the witness stand swearing that that was the individual who was selling crack cocaine to an undercover police officer. And the narrative then in the 90s, and I was there through 1998 doing that work, the narrative was crack cocaine was leading and contributing to the violence because of the drug trade in New Orleans and everywhere else in the country. There was a direct correlation between crack cocaine and the violence cities were experiencing. So I was I didn't know then what I know now. I was not chief. I didn't have my college degree then. So I was part of that system. And while I thought I was doing a good job, they told me I was doing a good job. I see now the outcomes of some of that work. Some of it was good, but some of it I see we contributed to this problem we have now that Dr. Muhammad so eloquently talked about.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. I want to talk a little bit more about police-involved shootings of citizens. I'm going to not be able to call everybody's name out historically, but I will bookmark them by saying that from the killing of Emmett Till through Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, and everybody in between, why do you believe the criminal justice system still lacks the adequate checks and balances against the unexplained racial disparities in holding police officers accountable in these situations? And I'll throw that out to whichever three of you wants to take it.
I mean, I'll start it off just since you evoked Emmett Till. If we can understand intrinsically and maybe even quite explicitly that Emmett Till's executioners, Roy Bryant, the husband of Carolyn Bryant, the woman who accused falsely Emmett Till, who she admitted many years later, for those who don't know, that he had not, in fact, done anything inappropriate to her. If we can understand that a white Southern jury would acquit these men who had admitted within their community what they had done and literally got away with murder, then we get some insight into a criminal justice system that is incredibly decentralized, incredibly sensitive to political whims and preferences, that overwhelmingly diminishes the voice of the Black community in deciding what justice looks like for itself. Which means that just as what's happened in the Rodney King trial, it was moved from LA County, where it occurred, to San Bernardino County, I believe, because the defense attorneys argued that those cops weren't going to get a fair trial. So we have a system that essentially still caters to a majority white population's understanding of justice and what it thinks are appropriate safeguards against its own sense of fear and moral accountability, which means that time and time again, Black people are on the losing end of receiving justice when white people get to stand in judgment of whether they did something to deserve being killed by a law enforcement officer. How else to explain George Zimmerman killing a 17-year-old after being instructed by the police to back off and then later to claim self-defense when he was the provocateur? How else to explain that 80% of white Americans, when polled by Pew Research, said they agreed with the acquittal of George Zimmerman? So in a country of decentralized law enforcement where 18,000 agencies are largely governed by local and state laws, of which the states are still dominated by white majority populations' voting preferences, Black people will consistently and continue to be on the losing end of justice unless we change the structure of policing.
Agreed. Chief Harrison or Chief Ramsey?
If I can just jump in real quick, I think
Sure.
it really just points to the need for criminal justice reform overall, not just police reform. I mean, right now the focus is on police, and rightfully so, or certainly understandably so. But the very first overarching recommendations we made in President Obama's task force report was that there be a comprehensive look at the entire criminal justice system. Don't just stop at police. And I hope with the movement that we see now, that it carries on and goes beyond just police reform. Otherwise, I don't think you're going to have the desired impact that we're all looking for, which is equality and fairness. Because, you know, you look at Lady Justice with the balanced scales and the blindfold, I would argue that Lady Justice sees quite well, and even she's biased as well. So unless we attack that and unless we deal with that and what happens throughout the system, then it's not going to really change to the degree that people really feel it and trust the system as they should.
Well, Chief, let me push you on that just a little bit more. And you took me to my next question, because when you, at President Obama's request, oversaw that task force, one of the things that you guys were thinking about was how so many communities are still in need of a thorough response and process that helps them build community trust. Now, there's some communities that do this better than others, and some have made progress, but it's clear that we have a long way to go. So when you talk about comprehensive reform, let's kind of dig into that a little bit more, because we've worked together for a long time, and as with Chief Harrison, and from time to time, I've heard not only you guys, but other police chiefs saying, we can't be responsible for everything. We can't be responsible for mental health or substance abuse or what the district attorney does. So can you take us through from, based on the work that you've done, what a deep dive on broad-based criminal justice reform would look like that would take us into a place where we have more community trust, if that's possible?
Well, I mean, I can certainly speak to the police perspective, but I think we have to really pick apart every single aspect of the criminal justice system and really not be afraid to challenge and to talk about it, bringing in community, bringing in stakeholders, bringing in experts, academics, people that really understand the system. The system is doing what it was designed to do. It's not doing anything other than what it was designed to do. And when you listen to Dr. Muhammad, you start to see the history of it and the reason why things are the way they are. But it doesn't mean it can't be changed, but it's going to take a lot of time because it's a systemic issue. It's a cultural issue. And we have to be able to attack it. And we have to be able to keep our communities safe at the same time and deal with the reality of crime taking place on the street. You know, the first pillar, we had 6 pillars in the task force report. The very first one was building trust and legitimacy. And the reason is because without that, nothing else really matters. And as I was listening to Dr. Muhammad give a little bit about the history of policing, it reminded me that in police academies, very little, if any, time is spent on the history of policing. And if it is, believe me, it doesn't get into some of the darker sides of policing. One of the things I did when I was commissioner in Philadelphia, because I was concerned about that, and I used to drive by the National Constitution Center all the time, and I stopped in one day to find out what they did, and they pretty much tracked the evolution of our democracy in America from the revolution all the way up to today. I asked if they could track the history of policing during that same time frame. And we came up with something called Policing in a More Perfect Union that we sent our officers to. And it does touch on a lot of those things because we're hiring 20, 21, 22-year-olds. They weren't alive during the civil rights era. They have no sense of history at all. And yet they go into some communities and wonder why people are hostile toward them. And that the hostility is there because of the history. And you need to understand the history so you can empathize with how people, I've often said police have to learn to see policing through the eyes of those being policed. And if you can do that, then you start to understand, and then you start to communicate entirely differently, interrelate differently, and you start to build that trust.
Well, Chief, thank you for taking us there. Chief Harrison, I want to kind of get into that in a little bit more detail. For those who are listening, the first thing I did when I was elected mayor of the city of New Orleans was invite the Department of Justice into the city of New Orleans to start working with us to completely reimagine the New Orleans Police Department. Chief Harrison helped lead that effort. It's probably the most robust consent decree in the history of the country. And Chief, you went through this chapter and verse trying to deal with the us versus them mentality that was between the police and the community, and then amongst the police themselves. There was a toxic police culture that you had to deal with. There was the training issue that Chief Ramsey talked about. We went through redefining use of force, body cameras, really trying to reimagine the police. And I wonder if you can take us through a little bit of the complexity, the difficulties, the tensions that you faced, and talk to us about some of the barriers that you faced as police leadership, trying to navigate, but trying to build trust in the community, maintain the trust of the police officers, but actually create a police department that actually achieved the objective of being able to protect and serve.
Yeah, those are all great points. That was a heavy lift because the New Orleans Police Department, because New Orleans had such a historical violent crime rate, murder specifically, there was always a belief, just like I'm facing now in Baltimore, that the primary goal of the police department was to just deal with crime. And there was such little focus on the appropriate management and proper management, cost-effective supervision of the members of the department, that the focus was always just on dealing with violent crime. When I came on in 1991, the common thing was guys came on that job would often say, and I even may have said it, I'm here to catch bad guys. Well, we had to fundamentally change the way we think. Like, we're not just here to catch bad guys, but we're actually here to serve and protect and prevent people from having these bad behavioral things that cause harm in the community. And so the consent decree was about adjusting the culture of the police department so that we thought differently about how we engage with the people. But there were officers who really fundamentally thought that they were just crime fighters. It was the warrior mentality, and we had to culturally shift to the guardian mentality and the guardian model.
But Chief, how did you do that?
I had the flexibility of appointing the leadership of the department, all of my deputy chiefs and all of my commanders, through a change we made that gave the police superintendent the authority to pick command and executive leaders. And it was about picking the right people who had the skill set and the temperament and the will to be able to accomplish reform and who were reform minded. The $10,000 question was always, can we reduce violent crime and reform at the same time? And it took a long time to do that. The answer is yes, but it was about making sure we had buy-in from the leaders who are in charge of all districts and division, who were leading and shaping and cultivating and grooming the younger rank and file to believe that reform can be accomplished while reducing violent crime. And we had to get out of the us versus them mentality. That was very strong in New Orleans.
Well, you say that, but you did it, but it wasn't that easy. What was some of the tension between trying to make sure that you had enough police officers in the communities protecting and serving, reducing violent crime, changing police officers' mentality about treating citizens as human beings and treating them based on their behavior and not race? How did that tension play itself out during the time that you were trying to repair and reimagine NOPD?
There was a comprehensive overhaul in the policies, comprehensive overhaul in the training, which translate to police performance. And so we had to train the department on implicit bias, on racial sensitivity, on the historical analysis of our city, and use of force, stops, searches, and arrests. And after that training and policy creation, we had to just go out and have quality assurance checks to make sure officers were doing it right. The very communities that had been over-policed, where excessive force was more common than not, are the very communities that are asking for more police because there was a violent crime issue. So we had to spend a lot of time and walk the tightrope, making sure that we had the appropriate number of police and the appropriate police with the right temperament to be in those communities to deal with both violent crime, but to make sure that reform efforts were going on at the same time. It was an improvement in technology. It was an improvement in policies and oversight, but close and effective supervision, holding frontline supervisors, sergeants and lieutenants accountable at every level, was how we actually changed the culture of the agency. And over time, with our performance, began to change the culture of the community by looking at citizen satisfaction reports, the use of force complaints, and all of those things that came in. Over time, we saw a downward trend in complaints and an upward trend in citizen satisfaction because we had to move some people out as we brought in new young officers in who had better temperament and the will and skill sets to be members of our department.
Yeah, and one more quick question. You wanted the EPIC program that you instituted, Ethical Policing is Courageous, whereby you guys trained the police officers to actually stop another fellow officer from doing something that he wasn't supposed to be doing. Was there resistance when you tried to implement that? And had that been in place, George Floyd would still be with us today, I think.
Absolutely. We all believe that George Floyd would still be alive had that happened. And perhaps some of those officers' careers could have been saved. There was not resistance to the EPIC program. There was some skepticism in the very beginning, but in the beginning, we pulled in the labor organizations with the civil rights activists, with the police department, and the people you least expect to work together were working well together. And we delivered this peer intervention program because we were able to figure out how to adjust discipline if a bad act did not happen, and how to change the reward system as opposed to just rewarding officers for the heroic deeds officers would do, the reward system for rewarding officers who intervened and stepped in front of a colleague to prevent a bad act from happening. And then we had to build a strong anti-retaliation policy at the same time so that the organization or its members couldn't retaliate against a member who stepped in front of their colleague to prevent a bad act. That changed the culture of the agency.
Khalil, I'm wondering, Dr. Muhammad, whether or not you have any questions along this line for Chief Ramsey or Chief Harrison, both of whom have been in the business of trying to reform police departments, and whether or not what they say rings true with you from your perspective, or they're more poignant questions you might want to ask them about that.
Well, I do want to ask about police unions, because in the case of Chief Harrison's example, I'm curious what role the union played in those reforms. What we're seeing across the United States and what we've seen for the past decade is some very high-profile union leadership really condemning the reform efforts, some of the simplest stuff to simply hold officers accountable even when it's quite clear that they've crossed the line. I live in New Jersey, although I commute to Boston to work. And right now, I'm not sure which union it is, but one of the major police unions have challenged in the New Jersey Supreme Court the subpoena power provision of the Citizen Review, Independent Citizen Review Board. I mean, this is a recommendation that's been on the books, honestly, going back 100 years, and I can provide the archival evidence for it. And so why would the union stand in the way of that, maybe for Commissioner Ramsey to talk about, but for Chief Harrison, I would just love to hear you describe how you got union buy-in, or if you did at all in your case.
Well,
go ahead, Mike, go ahead.
In New Orleans, it's a little bit different than what Commissioner Ramsey may have experienced, because Louisiana is a right-to-work state. While I may have used the word union, there was no collective bargaining contract. And we had 3 labor organizations, the FOP being the largest. There were 2 smaller organizations, but none of which had a collective bargaining contract. And so though they were always very vocal about reforms in the early days, and though they gave us some pushback, they really had no authority to really do anything about the reforms. It made it easier for us, and I'm finding that more challenging here in Baltimore. However, with this EPIC program, which is a peer intervention, we brought them to the table early on. And what we did was we showed them how this benefits the officers and how we could save careers and prevent officers from actually having discipline imposed upon them because we prevented a bad act from happening. Number 2, if a bad act happened and an officer did intervene, there could be mitigating circumstances toward the discipline. And that was certainly a great deal for them, and they bought into it very early on. So we didn't have as big of an issue legally with legal challenges. Now, though they didn't have a collective bargaining contract, the civil service division of New Orleans was really the biggest issue we had to deal with, because although the labor organizations didn't have legal teeth, civil service did. And so they would bring their issues to civil service. The fight was really with civil service, and we overcame just about all of those issues. The consent decree was the thing that we really needed to change the culture of the New Orleans Police Department.
Okay.
Well, I have had to deal with unions. Philadelphia has a very strong union, a very tight collective bargaining, a very restrictive collective bargaining agreement. Makes it very difficult to hold officers accountable. I've had officers that I've fired more than once. I fired them once for one offense. They went to arbitration, which is a whole nother discussion, which needs to be changed. And they got back, did something else that warranted termination, and I fired them again. And, you shouldn't have to constantly go through that sort of thing in order to rid your ranks of people who have no business being police officers through their actions. But having said that, cities have some responsibility for that too, because cities sign off on these contracts, and in many cases, management rights were taken away because of cities didn't want to provide a raise for the officers. Let's say they were asking for 2.5%, city could only do 1.5%. So then they go into some other area and they begin taking away some management rights to appease the union, and then you wind up with a situation where you're limited in terms of what you can really do. So yeah, it is a problem, but you have to work with them. I'm not anti-union, but I do think that they've become far too powerful. They influence what's going on. They have political action committees. They have a big voice in who the district attorney will be. And if the district attorney makes a decision they don't like, they are not hesitant to take them on and put up billboards, literally put up billboards against that individual. All that has an impact, but you have to deal with it. But it's very difficult to really run a police department today.
Thank you, Chief. I'll add my 2 cents here before we go to the questions from our audience. But you also have mayors that are really important players in this, as are your police chief, your district attorney, your local judges, if they're elected, are really important. School boards, important. All of those things are going to be critically important. Dr. Muhammad, as you noted in some of the statistics that you have cited often, the 2.2 million people that are incarcerated, most of them are incarcerated in state facilities as a result of being elected in cities or municipalities in towns. And so, as Chief Ramsey said just a little while ago, it's not just the police. If you want to change the whole system, it really is a deep dive in each one of those respective jurisdictions across the country. And finally, as Chief Ramsey said, and as Chief Harrison reiterated, there were times when police officers were fired and then the Civil Service Commission or arbitration put them right back on the street. And there is a tension there between rights that they may have and the ability of a police chief to determine who should be on the streets of the city. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but that's where the battle is going to be. Well, listen, let me turn to a couple of questions from our folks that are listening, and I appreciate them all. Many of these questions, not all of them, surround broadly this idea of reimagining police departments or defunding police departments. The word defund, I know, is a broad word, but they all kind of revolve around how to reimagine a police department. What are the kind of duties of services currently handled by the police that could be better handled by mental health professionals, substance abuse professionals? What are the things that police should be doing? What shouldn't they be doing? And what other kind of ways do you think that police departments can be reimagined so as to build community trust and to make the community safe? I just throw that out to any one of the three of you to answer.
Yeah, I'm dealing with that real time right here in Baltimore. We had our city council hearing a few weeks ago where we had the whole defunding issue, and the city council elected to cut $22 million out of our budget, some of which was about eliminating a few specialized units, some of which was eliminating overtime dollars, which, because we have a manpower shortage, those overtime dollars allow me to flex the size of the department to make us feel and look as large as we are paid to feel at full staffing. Now, that being said, it means many things to many people. I certainly understand moving dollars away for programs that, if effective, allow police to do less of the work so we're not asked to be all things to all people. The concern I have, and I think shared by many of my colleagues with police chiefs, those concerns are about, if we give away work to somebody who's better suited to do it, is that entity actually up and running and ready to take it from us? And can they do it as well as we do it? Because we're doing it right now. Is the entity actually built right now? And will there be gaps where there's no service and we cause further harm? Mayor, I give the analogy of building a stadium, of playing in a stadium. We tear down the stadium, we stop playing, we build a new stadium, we start playing the game again. As opposed to the correct way of building a new stadium while you continue playing in the old stadium, transition into the new stadium, then tear down the old stadium so that there are no gaps. That's the concern I think the police chief have if we stop a particular service because we're defunded for someone else who's not ready to receive it.
And I would agree with Mike. If I can just add just a couple of things. Number one, I think we have to remember how police wound up with some of these added areas of responsibility. At 3 o'clock in the morning, if someone's going through a mental health crisis and someone calls night, there are no mental health professionals that are working at 3 o'clock in the morning to be able to respond to that sort of thing. And so, one, they have to staff up those social services. I'm all in favor of that, believe me, whether it's substance abuse counselors, mental health professionals, or what have you. But they've got to staff them up to a point where they are available around the clock. The second thing that I think people don't realize, when they say defund the police, 97% of the Philadelphia police budget is salaries and benefits. There's no way you can take any significant money from there without impacting personnel. There's just no way you can do it because 97% of the budget is personnel costs. And so people need to understand the consequences. Maybe it's unintended consequences, maybe it's intended, but it's going to have an impact there too. So we have to be thoughtful and we have to think this thing through. And I'm not opposed to it, but it shouldn't be a knee-jerk response where you just grab money for the sake of grabbing money. And then where does that money go? Is it honestly going to go to those social services, or is it just going to be used to fill gaps and holes in city budgets elsewhere?
Dr. Muhammad, you want to respond to that and weigh in on this?
Yeah, no, I think that both Commissioner Ramsey and Chief Harrison are rightly expressing the technical concerns about what a transition would look like. And I appreciate, honestly, both of them affirming that there's nothing inherently wrong with the concept of defunding the police. In fact, I've been quite frustrated when I hear either Joe Biden, the presumptive, or I should say the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, or Jim Clyburn, one of the highest ranking members of Congress and a major supporter, say, this is a bad idea. Why are they talking about that if you have to explain it? We all understand intrinsically that police officers have been asked to do too much. And I've heard more than enough police chiefs admit that their officers are asked to do everything, and it's unfair to the officers, and the rank and file affirm that. So it's not rocket science to say we ought to go back to the drawing board and look at precisely what is the right balance between police service and public safety. It's also true that, according to the Vera Institute of Justice, 10.5 million arrests in the most recent data nationally have occurred, of which 5% are listed as truly violent crimes, which means that the scale and scope of policing is doing a lot of things, mostly traffic violations. Mostly people are being issued summonses or stopped on the presumption of some kind of municipal violation, which is exactly what broken windows and zero tolerance policing was meant to do. What was called problem-oriented policing was meant to identify early problems so they wouldn't become big problems. So we've got to go back to the drawing board, and we've got to make the case politically that the Reagan effort to defund government in general, to identify government as the source of America's problems, has seeped into every aspect of the public sector. And the fact that we don't have sufficient mental health services, the fact that, and I know this from a book, so pardon me for taking liberties with your own history, Chief Ramsey, but when you came to Washington, D.C., there had already been debates in the late 1960s about drug courts and decriminalizing various forms of drug abuse, because the idea was this is a public health problem. But it didn't go in that direction. It went into the direction of punitive responses to drugs. How interesting that we would come full circle 40 years later, have a massive drug epidemic going on in pockets of white America, and now call it a public health problem.
Right.
So it's got to really be, we've got to come back to the basics. We've got to go back 50 years and take the road we did not take, which is to invest in the alternatives to punishment, in the social services that we stripped of resources and then gave them to policing. You could win a whole lot of elections over the last 50 years saying, we'll give more money to the police. We'll give more money to the police. I'm going to put more police officers on the street. It doesn't say anything about the quality of the individuals who joined those forces, who were well-meaning and good-spirited, but more policing and more prisons was never the solution to most of the problems that ail low-income communities.
I agree.
Well, let me ask it this way to see if we can get some clarity on what I would consider to be fantastic and stable common ground. Both commissioners, both of you guys, it goes without saying, African-American men who have lived your life in policing, that have tried to reimagine and reform the institutions that you've led. Do you feel comfortable in being able to say to the country that, given what you know, historically and in practice, that you could in fact keep communities safe and make them safer if you could redirect resources to the front end rather than to the back end of the criminal justice system? And have you experienced the tensions, but have concluded that yes, actually, not only is it possible, but it's preferable for the country?
My personal opinion is yes, I think it is possible, but again, you have to be thoughtful, and it has to be a transition period. It's not going to happen overnight. But I do think finding alternatives to incarceration, building up social services so that you can provide treatment and prevention to people that need it, deal with domestic violence issues, have marriage counselors that are readily available, people going through a mental health crisis. I mean, all those things are good, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. So who fills that gap right now? It's going to be the police for a while longer. But cities have to make up their mind that if this is really the direction they want to go, then they've got to put the funding there in order to make it a reality. Because without funding, it's not going to go anywhere. And my fear is that money will be taken out of the budget, but the responsibility will remain. Now, I don't think that we can totally divorce ourselves of some of these. Some of those calls are dangerous. You're not going to get a social worker to go into some of these locations, and I don't blame them. But we can be a secondary role, not the primary role. Mm-hmm. And so homelessness is not criminal. We shouldn't have to deal with homeless issues. Somebody else should be dealing with that. But again, they're understaffed. So who's left? The cops.
Right. But Chief Harrison, before you respond, and I want you to, you can understand the skepticism of advocates and folks that have really been calling us to task on this with the old adage that asking us to wait almost always means never. So, thanks for the good intentions, but when are we really going to get to it? And how swiftly can we safely move past George Floyd's murder into a new way of being so that murders like that don't ever happen again?
Well, I agree with Chuck. We absolutely can move into safer cities, and because we did it in New Orleans, and we dealt with housing and education and prevention and interventions, rehabilitations. We dealt with systems that help members returning home from prison without actually defunding the police department. Now, I wasn't, the city's finance person, but we did that without defunding the police department. We can move past George Floyd and the others who have died. I think that it has to be national standards and legislation to create national standards, because every state is left to create its own standards. Cities within states, counties within states have variations of those standards, variations of those policies that causes one department to perform very differently from its next door neighbor, much less departments across the state and country. So there has to be national standards, and I'm working with the U.S. Conference of Mayors to come up with recommendations to lobby for that. And there has to be databases that we can put officers into. So when we flag an officer who is performing poorly or has been removed from service because of some type of performance, that other agencies are prohibited from hiring that officer. So officers can't just move from place to place, but the national standardization and some level of accreditation to some degree is how we levelize, equalize, and create equity, fairness, and transparency that helps us to minimize, if not eliminate, these kinds of things.
And we need better leadership in policing, Mayor, better leadership. Everybody talks about 18,000 police departments. I'll guarantee you we don't have 18,000 good police chiefs or sheriffs. That's just a fact. And so good policing and good leadership is more by chance than by design, because we don't do enough to develop that next generation of police leaders. And we got to get serious about this stuff, because that's the direction in which these departments are going to be going. Leadership matters.
Chief, I appreciate that. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to end on more of a personal question for both chiefs, and again for Dr. Muhammad. I don't know you can respond to this, but Chief Harrison, I know that you have two children that are in their mid-20s, and I can imagine that while all of these protests were going on, it's probably, I'm guessing now, but I bet you your kids were in the street.
My daughter certainly was. She's 23, fresh out of college at LSU, and her mother and I had to really talk to her about the distinction between protests and riots and what they look like and how to be careful and what to expect and how to behave when you're out there. And guess what? How to answer questions if you're encountering a police officer. And I've had to have that with my daughter, but I've had to have it with my son, who's a young attorney in New Orleans. And he went to an historically all African-American school there. We had to have the talk about what happens, man, when you have an encounter with police in New Orleans. But then he was afforded an opportunity to go away to college, to a predominantly all-white college, in the north part of the country. And we had to have the talk about what to do when you encounter these situations there, whether it's police or whether it's somebody else where there's some kind of engagement that you might have that you might perceive as racial. And so I've had those conversations in the last few weeks, Mayor.
And Chief Ramsey, about you, I know we talked about your son.
Yeah, I have a son. He's 33 now, but he became a Philadelphia police officer a few years ago. In fact, the proudest moment of my entire policing career was swearing him in as a police officer, just as an aside. But when he was a young man, just learning how to drive, I had to quote unquote talk about what to do if you're stopped and how to conduct himself and make sure that, you know, he kept his hands visible and so forth. But when he became a police officer, I had to have a second talk with him because, you know, now he's not just a police officer. When he's off duty, he's an African-American male and he's carrying a gun. And I learned that lesson early in my career when I was working plain clothes. You know, you run into an alley after a man with a gun, they give a description. You know, I'm African-American, I run in the alley, I got a gun. Guess what? In the eyes of a responding police officer, I become the man with the gun. And so you have to be very, very careful to avoid the blue on blue situations, as it's called. And now he's an ATF agent, federal agent. And again, you know, he's in plain clothes all the time. And I reminded him once again that you just have to be, don't assume that everybody knows who you are. And that's when, you know, the whole issue of bias and everything else comes in. You know, you've got to be very careful. And police officers, some of them are afraid, operating under stress, get tunnel vision, accidents can happen.
Well, Dr. Muhammad, I'm going to let you close this out. We have about a minute and a half left, so I hate to do this to you. You heard it, the past is not the past. It's still with it. It informs who we are, how we act today, and it directs our path forward. You feeling hopeful? You're feeling cynical? You're feeling impatient? Where are you, and how are we going to get where we're going, hopefully sooner rather than later?
I have tremendous hope when I see young people like Chief Harrison's 23-year-old daughter, like my own 18-year-old daughter, who's led a number of local protests, and I might add being one tiny number of an African-American in a crowd of white people. I haven't seen anything like this in my lifetime. I haven't read about it in any history book or seen it in any archive. And so there's a lot to celebrate in this moment and to appreciate that going back now nearly a decade when Black Lives Matter first burst onto the national scene, that there's real momentum, there's real change happening. The story about what's happened in Camden is an inspiration to many others around the country to see what's possible. Hopefully, Chief Harrison's story will continue to be lifted up. Obviously, the fact that it's the South and a non-union situation helps a great deal. So there's a lot to be hopeful, but I'm also a realist. And as long as we think this is a technical fix within the police community itself, then we will find ourselves having these conversations time and time again. This has to be considered the tip of the iceberg of a much greater problem of white supremacy in America that is deeply rooted, that is very hard to get out. And no matter how many Black firsts we put in the White House, in Congress, in a corporation, that is not going to fundamentally change a system where white people are still calling most of the shots and have a different sense of justice for them and for everybody else. And so you are doing great work, Mitch, with this initiative. I wish you all the best in it. I hope that more white Southern men find the courage to speak up and to speak out about what's happened to them and to bring more people into conversation so that they can change their attitudes and their behavior.
Dr. Muhammad, thank you. Chief Harrison, thank you. Chief Ramsey, thank you so much for the time that you've spent with us. Join us next week, same time, same place, to continue discussions on truth, on action, and on reconciliation. God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.